Acidicloop here. We're going to talk a little bit about music theory today, and the reason I want to do that is because it's fairly easy to kind of explain it visually with the Akai Force. Normally I'm a guitar guy. I've been doing guitar for quite some time. So when I teach guitar lessons, I teach it on the guitar. So this is kind of new territory for me to teach it this way, but I'm going to be doing some videos where I'm going to be creating some different funk, jazz, blues, and rock and stuff with the Akai Force, kind of break away from some of the electronica stuff. And some of it would involve understanding a little bit of how the theory of it works to understand exactly what I'm doing with some of the songs. So I wanted to do a series. I call it Theory Thug Life. Loving it. So we're going to tear it up and have a good time with this one here. I noticed that on this Akai here, it's going to be a little easier probably to visually understand it as opposed to like a book or charts and pictures and all kinds of stuff. So we're just going to do it visually here on my Akai Force. I got a little piano deal set up here. I think it's from Fabric, I think. Anyways, so let's talk a little bit about music theory in general. And we're going to focus on kind of the popular music, Western music, sometimes they'll call it. So this will be music theory for the, I guess you could say, normal music theory. When you start getting into some other more exotic stuff, you know, Mongolian or Hungarian scales and things like that, we're not talking about that here. We're talking about just traditional blues, rock, jazz, funk, pop, whatever. And I guess they would tend to call it Western style music. So we're going to go ahead and focus on that with this one here and talk about some of the details about it. Now, when you talk about the music and you talk about the music theory, tonality wise, you generally have two camps. You have a major sound and a minor sound. You also have some other ones that are a little bit more dissonant, like diminished or whatever. But we're going to focus this particular lesson on things like major and minor and scales and all that stuff. And I will posit that major scale is really all you need to know for what we're going to talk about here today. But first, let's talk about chromatic, because that's the easiest one to understand, because chromatic is every single note. Now, what I've done here is I've set up the Akai Force to be set on the very top where it says note config. That's with shift and then note. And then on the very top, you can't really see my screen very well on the small screen, but it's set to chromatic on the very top left. And then I've got it set to C, because C does not have any sharps or flats. So a lot of times people will teach in that key. And then below it, I don't really care about the roots and all that stuff. But on the far right, I have it set to major in this particular case. And the reason I set it to chromatic on the left is so that you can see every single note, but then also visually see and highlight the actual notes of the major scale for that key, okay? So let's talk first about how many notes there are. There's 12 altogether in Western style of music, and it goes from one letter to the other, and it's A through G, and that's it. And then it starts over again on A and starts with different octaves. So what I mean by an octave is, in this particular case, key of C is our root, so on the Akai, it's the colored one here, the pink one. So this is a C. The octave of that is the exact same note, but an octave higher. In other words, the tone of it is higher. And that in this case here would be this one here. So we're talking about 12 notes going from here to here, okay? So in this particular case, you can actually kind of call them out as you go. And there's what they call sharps and flats, okay? But before we get into that, let's just start off with just the major notes themselves. And in the major scale, there is no what they call sharps and flats, which I'll talk about in a second. But we're going to start from C. So we're going to count up in the alphabet and all the way until we get to C. So it'll be C. And then this next one here, and we're talking just in the major scale. Okay, that's D, E, F, G, A, B, and then the octave, which is C. Now, the notes in between are what they would call either sharps or flats. By sharp, it means I go up a half step. And when I talk about a half step, I'm talking about going from one note to another one directly beside it. If I talk about a whole step or whole tone, I'm talking about going from this note and skipping this one and going to this note here, okay? So 2 away from it. And they would call these things intervals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in this particular case, if I go up a half step, this is what they call sharpen it, okay? And the symbol is going to be a hashtag. If I want to do a flat, it means go back a half step, okay? Back a half step. So in this particular case, if I go from C to the next note, in this case, it is C sharp. Now there are 2 instances where this is not the case, where there's not a sharp or a flat. And that is going from B to C, and then going from E to F. Okay, so there is no E sharp. There is no B sharp. So in this particular case here, that's just one of those things that are just the facts of music theory for Western music. And there's not really a lot of explanation as to why that is. It's just the way it is. So 2 different places where this rule does not apply is B to C and E to F. So let's talk about that. Let's go through it. So if I start with C and I go up a half step, a C sharp. If I go from C sharp to the next note, we're in D. And what's interesting is this one here, the C sharp, is also what they call a D flat. So if I have a C and I sharp it, I have a C sharp. If I have a D and I flat it, in other words, go back a half step, it is a flat. You're probably thinking, well, that's kind of strange. 2 notes on the same note. This is what they call enharmonic, okay? And the only time this ever becomes really an issue theoretically or theory-wise is determining if it's a flat or sharp depending on the scale that's being played. And that'll be coming up later in some other later lessons I hope to get to. So don't worry your head about it right now. Just understand, yes, it is the same exact tone. So D flat is the exact same tone as C sharp, okay? If we're now on D, we then go up a half step here, and that would mean that's a D sharp. Now if we go up to the next note, we're now arriving at E. Now don't forget, because D is here, and the half step up is sharp, that also means that E flat exists. So that one there is an E flat. So D sharp and E flat are the same note. It's called enharmonic. Now here's where that rule applies that I talked about. E goes directly to F. There is no E sharp. It goes directly to F, okay? Which in this case would mean also there is no F flat, okay? So in this case, we're on our F. We're going to move up here to this next note because that's where it's at. And then from the F, we're going up another note here, half step. So that would be an F sharp. The next note would be G. So in this case, G flat is the same note as F sharp. So we're on G. We go up another half step. This is G sharp. In this case here, the next note up would be an F. I'm sorry, A, because it starts the alphabet over again. So the G sharp is also an A flat, okay? So then we move up another note here. We're on now A sharp, okay? And then if we move up, we're over here now on this note over here. So we're going to move up one more. In this case here, we're on a B. So B and B flat and A sharp, that's the same note. B flat is the same as A sharp. But remember our rule, here's the second instance where this is no longer, this doesn't have a sharp. So B goes directly to C. There is no B sharp and there is no C flat. Okay, so let's go over it again. So we have C, C sharp, D, which also means this is a D flat. And then from D, we go to D sharp. And then from there, we go to E, which means that this is also an E flat. In this particular case, the E goes directly to F per our rule that we talked about. So there is no E sharp, there is no F flat. Okay, and if we look here, the next note, we're going to go up this way. So there's our F. That means this is F sharp. Next one is G, which means G also is G flat here. F is F sharp, same note, called N harmonic. Okay, so here's our G. Then we go up G sharp, in this particular case here. A is the next one up, which means that A flat is the same as G sharp. Then we move up, A sharp. I'm going to go up here to the next row. Okay, there's A sharp right there. B, which means this is B flat, is the same note as A sharp. But then our rule kicks in again. B goes directly to C, so there is no C flat and there is no B sharp. Okay? That is all 12 notes of the music scale. That's it. Now, there's ways that you can carve out of that chromatic scale, and they would call this similar names or interesting names like diatonic, for example. And the major scale would be considered something like that. It would be that would be what it is. And what we're doing with the major scale is we're pulling 7 notes out of that 12 that'll be used as a scale. Now, generally, the major scale has a happy tone to it, more poppy, right? Whereas the minor scale has a more melodic or melancholy or kind of a moody sound, as it were. But that also is 7 notes. Now, there are some scales, for example, the pentatonic minor, which will take 2 notes out of that scale and come to 5, hence the word penta and tonic, penta being 5. So pentatonic minor would be, for example, or pentatonic major would be the same as the major scales, but carved down, taking 2 notes out. And they typically would associate the pentatonics with singable notes in a scale, stuff that are generally sung in melodies and just generic pop and rock and stuff like that. It's a lot easier to sing pentatonic scale as opposed to a major scale, although you've heard the major scale before in movies like Sound of Music, right? So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So that's essentially where that came from for that one there. Do a deer, female deer. I can't remember the whole song, but anyways. So that's the chromatic scale. Now there's something they call intervals as well, and we may get into that into a different lesson. But let me talk about the major scale now in this particular case. So the major scale, like I mentioned, is going to be carved out of that chromatic scale using a particular pattern, okay? And this particular pattern, we can kind of see what it is. So if I go from this note, which is the root, okay, the pink note, I'll get my pen here. So the pink note, if we skip this one and go here, this is what they call a whole step, usually symbolized with a W. So it goes whole, and then from there, we can see it goes whole again, and then from there, we can see it does a half, okay, which leads us here. So then we also see from there, it does another whole. So far we have whole, whole, half, and then we go whole, 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 half. So that formula is for the major scale. In this particular case, it's going to be for every key you play in, okay? Never going to change. If you know the major scale pattern, you can basically play any of the popular styles. And they also have things called modes of that major scale, and they use these Latin, I believe, types of names for them, like Phrygian, Aeolian, Dorian, things like that. And those are all derived off the major scale. So really all you have to know is the major scale. Even to make chords, all you really have to know is the major scale. And we're going to do a whole lesson on how to create chords, how they're done, even though it's easy to do in the Akai Force because it has a chords section. But to make them yourself and to understand how they're created, we're going to be using the major scale for that. That's why I'm teaching this major scale for the first one, okay? Now, on your Akai, to make it easier visually, now that you understand the chromatic part of it there, is that you can actually move it to scale mode. So I just move the top left one to scale, and then I can say start on root. I can move that top one to start on root. So here's our C, and this is the major scale for the key of C. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Okay? So this is an easy way to kind of visualize it. So I'll give you an example of how this becomes useful. when we start getting into creating chords, it's actually using, you could think of the major scale as using a numbering system. So for example, root 1. The next note in the major scale, 2. Next note, 3. Next note, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the octave, which is 8. Okay? So when you start creating chords, there is a basic formula for what they call a triad. It takes the 1, the 3, and the 5 to make a chord, and it pulls it off of this major scale. Okay, so this is kind of a precursor to what I'm going to teach in a different lesson about chord creation, but I want to show you where the major scale plays a part in this. So in other words, here's my C. If I want to make a C major chord, I take the 1, 2, 3, and the 5. So 1, skip the 2, 3, skip the 4, 5. Play those 3 together. That is a C major chord. That's it. That's all there is to it. Now, in your major scale, you can also harmonize the scale, which they actually do for you as well by going to harmonize up on the top left, but we're not going to worry about that because we want to teach you how it's done. But you can make basically a chord scale, right? So C, and then the next row would be, again, using the 1, 3, and the 5, but you're going to start your root note as this one. So 1, skip the 2, go to the 3, skip this 4th, go to the 5. So in this particular case, we know C, and the next note is D, so what we're making here is what they call a D minor. And there's a reason for that, and we'll explain that in some other lessons, because there's a way for you to quickly figure out which notes in a scale are going to be major and which ones are going to be minor, or which chords are going to be major and which ones are going to be minor. In this particular case, C, or the key of C major, is a C major, and then the next note is a D minor. But we'll get more deep into that, but I want to show you why it's important to know the major scale, because you can build every single chord of every single song that you want, the base of it, using the major scale, which is pretty awesome. All right, so let's go back here. I'm going to switch it back to chromatic, and we'll go back to starting on the 4th. All right, so in this particular case, what I want to talk about is something they call intervals. And the way they do the intervals is it's a naming for it. And it's another one of those things where you just kind of take it, it is what it is, that's what they name it. And sometimes it may not make sense of why something's the way it is, but that's how they do it. So it's important to show you kind of what the intervals are. When I'm talking about an interval, we're talking about going from one note, okay? In this case, we're going to say the C, and then its distance to another note, okay? If I go from C to itself, it's unison, so it doesn't really have a different tonality, a different tonal quality. It's C unto itself, okay, unison. But if I go from C and I add this one, which is the next one up, this is called a minor second, okay? In this particular case here, if I were to go from C and then go to the 3rd one, okay, the distance between the C and the 3rd one, this is called a major second, okay? Then if I go from the C to the 4th interval here, then this is what they would call a minor 3rd. If I go from C to the next one up here, this is what they would call a major 3rd. You start to see a little pattern happening here, that the flatted version, or the flatted note before it here, is the minors in this case here. So again, C unto itself is unison. C to the next one, this is called minor second. C to this next one, the 3rd one, is called a major second. C to this one, minor 3rd. C to the next one, major 3rd. Then we get into C to this one, and this is a 4th, perfect 4th they call it. And again, I'm not really sure of the reasoning for the names that they have for it, but it is what it is. So now we're going to go from this one to the next one. This is what they call a flatted fifth. Okay, and these are all if you look them up online, you'll see there's different names they give it. Sometimes they'll say like augmented fourth or some other weird names or whatever. I'm just going to call it a flatted fifth. And then they may also call it like tritone or some other kind of weird names. This is the ones I'm usually familiar with. And again, we're going from our C to this next one here, and this is what they call a perfect fifth. And then if I go from C to the next one, this is called a minor sixth. Go from C to the next one, major sixth. And then go from C to the next one, this is called a minor seventh. Go to the next one, major seventh, octave. Okay, so we're now in an octave note format right there. So this is what they basically would call your intervals. Okay, so when you're actually messing with the intervals, you just kind of need to be familiar with what they are, but you don't necessarily need them to create what you're going to create. You really just need to know the major scale. That's the major part. Okay. So in that case, I would use a numbering system, in my opinion, to understand the major scale as far as what we're going to use it for formulas and such, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That's what I would use that for. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the major scale. And then the minor scale, we'll talk about some other ones here when we talk about modes and natural minors. Okay, but for now, that's just a quick lesson on just kind of the basics of chromatic intervals and the major scale. It's important to understand the major scale because it will be the core of absolutely everything we do. Okay, so until next time, don't forget to get in the loop. Acidicloop. Peace out, players.